Darkness, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Absence, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Stillness, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Silence, I've never been that comfortable with circles. Not circles the shape, but the formation. I think it has something to do with some early childhood traumas, preschool, kindergarten, daycare, being forced to sit in circles, jostling against the other students, trying to find a seat closest to center and teacher, always finding myself somehow outside of center. I'm pretty good with squares, though, like the square tiles in the hallways outside of the classrooms I should have been in, the square of the walls, the principal's office, the squared edges to the vice principal's ruler. I guess that's probably why I really have difficulty with circles. There's something about being on the edge that makes the space between the edge and the outside so much infinitely smaller. And I know I'm not a fan of being outside of circles, let alone having them be closed. So I don't think it's any accident that I ended up becoming a worker. My job is to work with those marginalized folks, those people who exist in the margins, and I do that by facilitating circles, bringing people in. In my personal life, I think it has a lot to do with why I've worked so hard and ambitiously to move myself from margin to center. Education, job, friends, marriage, dog, 2 vacations a year. And that's where the problem, I guess, arises. This notion of the center being the source of my good. I'm sure there's some evolutionary scientist somewhere who can speak to the basis for those kinds of beliefs. Some early human tribes gathered around a fireplace. It makes sense. The closer you are to the flame, the more likely you are to get fed. The further you are away from the flame, the more prone you are to the elements and all of those scary things that lurk in the dark spaces at the edge. But we don't exist in those times anymore, and particularly for my fellow human services professionals and individually for us as people, we need to begin to see the power and the potential that exists in living in the margins, in the peripheries, that creative space. In 2009, I was working for a local aid service organization as the research and program coordinator. I had the opportunity to pilot one of their first HIV prevention and health promotion programs for marginalized, at-risk, gay and bisexual youth of color. In 2010, we were able to secure some research funding, and I was named principal investigator of its evaluation. To date, we've had almost 200 young men go through that program. I, alongside some senior researchers and community members, evaluated this mixed method study. What about this program was so effective? almost across the board, all of the participants were able to say that it impacted them in some kind of way. I'll be honest in saying that our quant measures and the data that we gathered weren't too significant in terms of statistics. But the rich data that we were able to gather from our qualitative research showed that there was something that this program did for these young men. First, most of these young men were able to say that it interrupted their storyline. Whatever narrative that they walked in with about who they were as young people, as young men of color, as queer individuals, was interrupted in their participation in this program. Secondly, it was a space that was safe. In the presence of their peers, they were able to bear witness to their own process. And third, through the inclusion of adult mentors, they were able to see modeled back to them new ways of being. For me, this links back to this idea and notion of the periphery and creation, and to another idea that I have around prophetic performance. For me, prophetic performance is that forestating and creating movement, that gesturing towards and gesturing in of a new way of being. It can only be experienced in the gap. It can only be experienced in the peripheries, in the darkness, in the stillness, in the silence. I had my own prophetic performance in 2007. I'd been working in social services for about 2 years. I had a goal. Remember? The house, the job, the bank account, the dog, the marriage. I wasn't really intending to be at this job for too long. I had better things in my sights. And in 2007, I had an HIV scare. And when I say scare, I mean a scare. I took a 2-week vacation to Mexico. Sun, sand, and lots of alcohol. On my return, I spent the next 3 months in that window period waiting before my test in a blank space. During that time, I was asked to facilitate a workshop for a group of expelled students. On my arrival at this workshop, the workers informed me that they would be assigning me a child and youth worker for my safety. And I could get it. Walking into that classroom, it was a rowdy group of young people. I began my presentation, going through the narrative and the script that I'd been given. And then at some point, I went off script. If you were to ask me what I said, I could not tell you. I know it has something to do with purpose being like an anchor. And as the waves of your life throw you to and fro, purpose will always bring you back to home. And then something else about if you have no other goals in life, let there be one. That when you die, people cry real tears at your funeral for a life well lived. When I was done the presentation, you could hear a pin drop in the room. And out of the quietness, a young girl in the back of the class lifted her hand and said, "Sir, are you a pastor?" And something inside of me resonated with what she said. And I spent the rest of the afternoon fielding questions from the class about what it meant to be a community or social service worker. One of the head honchos in the class pulled me aside and disclosed to me that he had been contemplating going to school to study to be a social worker, but was scared to tell his friends because it's not really a cool thing to do. A week later, after finding out my test results and breathing a sigh of relief, I also dealt with the shift in my consciousness. all of a sudden, the work that I was doing had a different tonality to it. I was showing up in it in a different way. And since that time, I've done fairly well. I'm showing up differently in the work that I do, and I approach it with a different type of energy than I did before. And that's the prophetic performance. The interruption. The space left behind after the interruption. There's an old quote that says, "Nature abhors a vacuum." The universe doesn't do empty spaces. If you give it enough time, it will fill that space with just what is required in that moment and in that time. And this applies on an individual level and on a communal level. As human services professionals who are creating programs and services, we often go straight to prescribing ways of being to our clients. This is going to fix you, and it's going to make you good. And if only you could do this. Instead, our jobs, I think, are to interrupt people's ineffective or partial storylines about themselves, about their world. And second is to create the space for them to be able to sit with the nothingness that's left behind. And then teach them to trust that they'll respond with that prophetic performance that will be exactly what is required. On an individual level, it means us being patient in those uncomfortable and unsure moments. It means standing in the not knowing. Not strategizing ways to find our way back to center. Standing on the peripheries and trusting that the peripheries will grow exactly what we need. Now, I'm not saying that this is a fairy tale process, that it ends in happily ever after. It's a continual process that must be re-experienced. I tell people that I'm a remedial student of the universe, and I mean it. I've been learning the exact same lesson 15,000 times in 28 years. But I've allowed myself to get to a place where I am open to that not knowing. To be really honest, I'm in it. Right now, actually. In 2 months, I will graduate from the 2-year program in graduate studies at York that I took 3 years to complete. 6 months ago, I stepped away from the job that I held for 6 years. 2 weeks ago, I signed over the home that I spent 5 years building. And 2 months ago, I signed the papers to end the marriage and partnership of 2 years. My bank accounts leave much to be desired. But I would argue that this moment for me, this moment is my prophetic performance. Dry lips and shaking knees. This is my stepping into, gesturing towards, and gesturing in my new state of being. If I can trust. And I would offer those of us who are in the human services professions and those of us who aren't, those of us who are marginalized and those of us who are otherwise, to be allowed that opportunity to be pulled into those peripheral spaces at the edge. Forget about the center, it ain't all that good. And trust. Trust that the universe does not do empty spaces, and trust that nature abhors a vacuum, and trust that what will be performed here in the edges is exactly what is required. Not to do what's already been done, but to create what's required. I have a prayer or an affirmation, because I've been told not to pray, for all of us who are being pulled to the peripheries. All of us who are in a state of resisting, and those of us who are just lingering in it. May you see birth in that creative darkness that's only equal to the womb. May you experience ego's absence long before you reach your tomb. You know that peaceful stillness that exists in every breath. And may you hear that perfect silence in this space of nothingness. Thank you for listening.
All right.
Amazing!
That was awesome.
Guys, it's lunchtime.
Lunchtime.
All right. So we're going to see you back here around 1-ish. We're starting the afternoon at 1. Lunch is upstairs.
Yeah, second floor. Don't forget to check out the graphic recording up there.
Yeah.
And yeah, you'll see you a little after 1.